Welcome back to the fourth web design workshop. This is actually our second to last workshop, so we're going to have to cover a lot in this lesson so we can be able to finish our websites by the end of next class, which is next week. So we're actually almost done with this workshop, and you're going to have a completed website by the end of it. Last week we started getting into the logical aspect of programming in web design or with web design, and that is with JavaScript. We learned a lot about the language fundamentals with JavaScript. We learned about operators, variables, all that great stuff, and today we're going to take that a step further and look at more structures in JavaScript, and these are conditionals, loops, functions, and we'll even get to, at the end, if we have time, the part where we can connect our JavaScript code to our HTML and CSS, and this is really the core of web design because it's most important to connect these two things so they can work together, and that is called the DOM or DOM, however you want to say it. So let's move on. So our objectives for today are conditionals. We're going to be looking at the if statement, the else if statement, and just else statements. We're also going to be taking a look at loops. We're going to go over the while loop and the for loop. We'll look over how to write functions and when is the best time to use functions. And as I stated before, we are going to learn how to link our JavaScript to our HTML and CSS with the DOM, which is Document Object Model. Alright, so today we're not actually going to be coding in our websites. Well, maybe towards the end we will when we get to the DOM, but we're actually going to be using Replit again. So if you just type in repl.it, you should go to their website, or you can just look up REPL and it'll be the first result, and then you want to click start coding. You don't even need to sign up because you don't really need to save this code. It's just so I can show you how conditionals and loops work. So you're going to want to pick Node.js again and click create REPL. Alright, so now it's going to take you into this editor. If you watched last lesson, this should be a little bit familiar. So the first thing we're going to take a look at is conditionals. And before we start doing that, I want you to create two variables. I want you to create a variable called name and set it as your name. It should be a string. And also, I want that variable to be not changeable in the program. So I'll give you a hint. You're going to have to use a different assigner of the variable. So our available assigners are const, let, and var. If we want their variable to not change, well then we want it to stay constant, so we would use the const assigner. So I want you to create that name variable, and I also want you to create a variable called age, and that should be a number, and make that a variable that can be changed later on in the program. So I'll give you a few minutes to do that. Alright, so hopefully you have those two variables, or if you're a little confused on what I was saying, then I'll show you what I meant. So when creating our first variable called name, we want to make sure that this variable is not changeable. Usually your name doesn't change. I mean, in some cases it can, but for the most part, names are something that are constant. So we can do that by using the assigner const. And then we put our variable name, which is name, and then we set that equal to your name, which is going to be in a string, and don't forget that ending semicolon. For the age variable, this can be changed later on because our age is always changing. I mean, even if a day or a minute passes, we're a minute older. So our age is constantly changing. So we can make this a variable that can be assigned later on. So we can say let age equal 16, or whatever age you are. Alright, so we're going to be creating a few scenarios with these two variables that may be applicable to websites or anything really. So now let's start with our conditionals. Conditionals basically check if something is true or not, and then they act on that decision. So I'm going to create a scenario with these variables. I'm going to say, let's say someone is signing up for an event, and the event requires you to be 18 years of age or older. So I can say if the person is 18 or older, then they can go to the event. So basically, we want to make this replicated in our code. And how do we do that? We can use the if statement. Notice how I started this with if? Well, if you can start a sentence with if, you're probably going to be using an if statement. So the way if statements work is we put if, and then we put these parentheses, and whatever we put inside the parentheses, it's comparing if it's true or false, and then it's going to later act on that. So what are we checking in this if statement? So we have the if, and then if the person is 18 or older. So the 18 or older part is going to be checked within these parentheses. So we have our variable age. So if age is greater than or equal to 18, so that's going to check if they're 18 or older, then our then is replicated by these curly braces. This is where the body of our code goes in the if statement. So if this is true, so let's say the person is 18 years old, then this, whatever code is in here, is going to run. So in this case, we're just going to console log. We'll actually make it a bit fancy. We'll say, congrats, and then plus the name. Congrats, you are able to attend the event. Great. So now that we have this, we can basically check if the age variable is greater than or equal to 18, and if it is, we can make a decision based on that. So if I run this, we see that we get nothing, and that's because I'm under the age of 18, so I'm not really allowed to attend this event. Now, if I were 18 and I run this, then I would get, congrats Alexa, you are able to attend the event. Great. So right now, it prints nothing out when the person is less than 18 years old. But we really want to make sure that all cases are accounted for and that people know what to do. So let's say they clicked a button on your website and that showed up on their screen, the congrats, you are able to attend the event. Well, we also want that, or a different version of that message, to show up when the user is not legible to go to this event, because then they're going to be confused if they get no message, and they'll probably be like, why is this not working? I can't attend the event for some reason. So we want to let them know why. So in that case, we can create an else statement. And this else statement is going to run whenever this if statement is false, or whatever is in here is false. So else, we can console.log sorry, and then plus the name. You are not able to attend the event. And we may even want to say that it's because they're too young. However, I'm just going to leave it like this for now. And if we run this, we see that we get, too many spaces there. If we run that, we see that we get, sorry Alexa, you are not able to attend the event. And then that is because I am 16 years old, and since 16 is not greater than 18, it's going to go over here, and it's going to run this code. So this code is not even going to be run because this is not true. Alright, so what if I wanted to make a change and say you can go to the event if you're 16 years old, but you need to have some parental consent? I can do that with an else if statement. So the else if statement is kind of a combination of the if and else statement, and it kind of goes in the middle of these two. So if I do else if, and then I set it up the same way as the if statement, and I put these parentheses, and then I could check if age is greater than or equal to 16. And if it is, I'm going to say you are able to come to the event with parental permission. Alright, and how about we change that U to the name variable, and we'll say that. So if we run that, we can see that Alexa, oh, I forgot the U. Alexa, Alexa, you are able to come to the event with parental permission. So this is kind of our 3 scenarios here, and I'm just going to show you all of them working. So if I say 18 and I run this, I'm going to get you're able to come to the event with you don't need a parent's permission. And then if I say I'm 12 and I run this, it's going to say, sorry, you are not able to attend the event. Alright, so when I'm 16, I'm just going to go through the kind of flow of this if statement. So it says that I'm 16 years old, so if I plug 16 into this age variable here, that's going to be false because 16 is not greater than 18. So none of this code is going to be run, so I'm going to jump here, and then it's going to check if 16 is greater than or equal to 16, and that's true. So everything's going to run in here, and once one of these, you can picture these as blocks, so the else if is its own block, the if is its own block, and the else is its own block. Once one of these blocks is run, none of the other ones after it get run. So for example, when I'm 16 years of age, this else if statement is going to run, and that means that it totally exits the program after I run this statement, and it doesn't go here and run this. We see that we're only getting one thing that's printed out to the console. So once one block is run, it exits this series of if and else statements. Alright, so I think that's it with conditionals. Now we can move towards loops. So I'm just going to comment this out for now so it doesn't interfere with anything. But the first loop we're going to take a look at, or actually I'm going to delete this so I can save some space. The first loop that we're going to be taking a look at is the while loop. And the while loop is good for running a piece of code multiple times until a certain condition is met. For example, let's say I wanted to keep track of a user's age in this, I'm going to use the same scenario. So let's say a person signs up for the event, they're 15 years old, but they can't attend the event, but next year when they're 16 years old, we want our program to update and tell them, yes, they are available to or able to attend the event. We can do that, or keep track of their age at least, using a while statement, or while loop, sorry. So we can say while, and then we're going to have these parentheses, and we're going to say while age is less than 16, then we're going to run the code inside of here. So while the user's age is less than 16, we're going to console log sorry, you cannot attend the event. Alright, so let's say our age was 15. And then we always want to make sure that our while loop is not going to run infinitely. So if I were to run this right now, and our age is equal to 15, our age, if we plug that in here, 15 is less than 16, well, 15 is always going to be less than 16. So this while loop is going to run infinitely because there's nothing in the program to change this age variable. And that can cause a lot of problems if you run it infinitely. It's a mistake a lot of people make sometimes by accident. But to fix that, we can increase the age variable every time we go through this loop. So in this situation, every time we run this while statement, or every time we run this code here, it's going to add a year to their age. So we're going to say age equals age plus 1. And remember from last video, we can actually change this to a number of things. But I'm going to change it to age plus plus because that seems the most efficient way or nice looking way to do it. But it's your preference. If you want to keep it the other way because you understand it better, that's totally fine. So if I run this, we see, sorry, you cannot attend the event. And then we should probably put something at the end here saying, you can attend the event with parental permission. So once it exits the loop, it's going to run this. So if we run this again, we'll see that first when we run it, it says, sorry, you cannot attend the event. But after 1 year, when the user turns 16, it says you can attend the event with parental permission. So what basically happened here is it took this age 15 and it put it in here and it said 15 is less than 16, so that's true. So that means it's going to run this piece of code here. And then after it runs the console.log, it's going to run this and increase the age by 1. So now our age is 16. Now we go back and we plug 16 into here, and 16 is less than 16. That is false. So it's going to exit this loop. It's not going to run any of this, and it's going to go down here. So that's why we only get one of these sorry you cannot attend the event, and one of the you can attend the event with parental permission. So if I change this to 14, I want you to think about what might happen or what might print out to the console. So think about that, and I'm going to run this. and it says, sorry, you cannot attend the event, sorry, you cannot attend the event again, and then it's going to say you can attend the event. This is because before the user turns 16, this piece of code is run twice because the user is first 14 and they can't attend. Then their age increases after 1 year to 15 and they still can't attend, so it's gonna console log it again. And then when they're finally 16, it's going to run this piece of code. So you can see where I was trying to go with this, but this is how you use the while loop. We're also going to take a look at the for loop, which is used a lot. However, it's a little bit tricky, the syntax, which is basically how it's written. Syntax means how a piece of code is written. So there's a few things that we have to talk about with the for loop, and the while loop and the for loop are very similar to each other. They're just different ways and different preferences. Some are better for some cases and some are better for other cases. They kind of go hand in hand. Alright, so I'm going to delete this code here. And the way we start a for loop is by doing for, and then we put our parentheses, and then we create a few things in our parentheses, but first I'm going to talk about the situation, or create a situation where we would use this for loop. So let's say we also had a variable that counted the number of attendees, so it kept track of that. Let's say we have 50 attendees. So this for loop, I want this for loop to calculate the number of snacks needed. And then we'll say each attendee gets 2 snacks at the event. I don't know why I put a semicolon there, sorry. Alright, so this is a case where we would use a for loop. So let's create a variable in our for loop that's going to keep track of how many times we need to run this loop. So we can set let I, and this is what we usually use. It's usually I as a variable that we used, and we set that equal to 0. Now this I variable is a little bit different from the variables I defined up here because it can only be used in this for loop. So if I try to access this I variable anywhere else, it's going to give me an error because it's only defined in this for loop. So we're going to set I equal to 0, and then we're going to have a sort of condition that the for loop needs to meet each time for it to be run. So we're going to run this every time I is less than the number of attendees. And then we're going to increase I by 1. So we do I++. So basically, the first time we run this, we're setting I equal to 0, and each time we're checking if I is less than the number of attendees, which is 50 in this case, and then we increase I each iteration of this loop. So this is a bit confusing, I know, but once I kind of code what's inside here, you'll get the gist of it. Alright, so we have this for loop here, and we want this for loop to calculate the number of snacks, so we're going to need to create a variable called number of snacks. I'm just going to put it at the top there. We're going to set that equal to 0 for now. And this for loop is going to actually calculate for us the number of snacks we need. So inside the for loop, let me just shrink that a little bit. We want to change the number of snacks, and we want to define it as the number of snacks plus 2. So what this for loop is basically doing, it's going through each of the attendees. So for every attendee there is, it's going to add 2 to the number of snacks. And that encompasses the idea that each attendee will get 2 snacks, because every time there's an attendee, we're adding on 2 snacks. So this is what that for loop does, and if we run this, we see that we get 100 snacks. And this seems like an easy calculation. I mean, to get the number of snacks for each, to get the total number of snacks, if each attendee gets 2 snacks, you just do 2 times 50, which is 100. But this is just to show you the concept of the for loop, and the for loop is really great when you're doing these complex calculations, and sometimes it's not even calculations, it's just organization and filtering. All that stuff can be done with the for loop, and this is just a very basic example, but you can see how it's used in this scenario. And I know the for loop is a bit more confusing than the while loop because it has these strange parameters in here, but let me just show you how you can't access the variable I later on in the program. So if I try to print I out, so if I run that, I'm going to get an error because I is only able to be used in this for loop because it's defined in there, but that has to do with locality stuff, and we didn't really talk about that. But just know that the I in this, the new variable we created in this for loop, is not really able to be accessed outside of it. Alright, so we're finished with loops. Now let's move on to functions. The best way for me to describe a function is a container that holds code. Variables are containers that contain information like numbers, strings, but functions are containers that contain code. So usually use a function when you want to repeat code multiple times, but you don't want to rewrite the code again and again. Let's say you had a piece of code that was 50 lines long, and you had to repeat that every time that you did something else. Well, instead of copy and pasting that 50-line code 20 times, you can just call it using a function. So let's get started, and we're gonna keep up with this number of snacks example. And so I'm gonna create a function called get snacks. So I'm gonna say, we define a function by we say function, and then we put the name of the function, so we'll say get snacks. And then we put these parentheses here, and then we put our curly braces. So right now we have defined the function get snacks. Now what do we put in this function? Well, we put the code that gets the number of snacks. So this is the code that does that, this for loop. So we can just paste this in here, and now this is inside a function. Very cool, very cool. Alright, so now the indents are better. But basically a function, well, if I run this, we see that nothing happens, and that's because the function is just defined and it's never called. So if I wanted to calculate the number of snacks, I could call this function, so I could say get snacks with these parentheses, and that is going to call this function. And I'm going to actually console.log it to show you. So I'm going to console log get snacks, and if I run that, oh, I get undefined. You know what, I'm just gonna run get snacks, and then inside of the function I'll console.log the number of snacks at the end. So if I run this function, I'm gonna get 100. there's also some things that we can add to these functions, and that is within these two parentheses. We can add these things called parameters or arguments, and they basically allow us to insert variables or other data types into our function. So in this example, the getSnacks function, it kind of takes in the value of number of snacks. Well, it actually takes in the value of attendees. So what we can do is create a argument or parameter inside of this function. So we can say participants, or I don't know, people, and then we change every word that says attendees to people. Alright. And then what we can do, so right now we have a parameter called people. Now when we call the function, we need to give it or feed it that parameter. So what we do is put attendees in here. So what this basically is saying, this line of code here, it's saying to replace every instance of people with the variable attendees, and the variable attendees is equal to 50, so it's going to replace every instance of people with 50. So if I run that, I'm going to get 100 again because it's the same thing, I just added a parameter, but it makes it easier for us to change the variables later on. So let's say if I made my attendees to 40, 10 didn't come. So if I run that, we're going to get 80. So we can see that the number of snacks changes, and it's better if you use parameters in this instant. And we put this in a function because we might have to run this getSnacks function multiple times. For example, we may have to run this function every time that a person signs up for the event. We might have to recalculate this number. So right now this piece of code is really only 3 or 4 lines long in here, but if we have to repeat that multiple times, it can get lengthy. So if we put it in a function, we can see that we just call it with one line and it does all this code in one line. It's kind of like these 4 lines of code packaged into this one line. So that's the deal with functions. There's also multiple ways to define functions, but this is the most popular way to define them. Alright, so now we can move on to the DOM or the DOM. And before we do that, we want to exit out of Replit, which is the code editor I've opened now, and we want to go back to glitch. So we're going to go to glitch.com. If I can spell. And it's going to take us here. You want to log in and then edit your project. Alright, and then we can open our index.html. We're actually going to start in the HTML first because there's something we need to include in it, similar to how we needed to include something for the CSS to work. We need to include something in our HTML so that the JS or JavaScript works. So what we need to do is see this line right here that I told you to comment out in the beginning. We're actually going to uncomment this. So do command / if you're on Mac or control / if you're on Windows. And you should get this script source equals / script.js, and then defer. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. So what this line basically does, it connects our script.js, so this file here, with our index.html. So now these files are communicating with each other, similar to how this link tag, if you remember this in our prior lessons, connects our HTML to our CSS file. So if we go back to HTML, we have our source is script.js, which is the name of the file, and then we have this defer here. We usually put in this defer, and what it does, it basically makes sure that this script tag is loaded after everything in the body is loaded. Because sometimes in our JavaScript, we want to access these certain elements. And if HTML, if we call this tag, or if it loads before these load, then it's not going to find these elements. So you may get an error. So to stay away from these errors or possibly fix them, we can add this defer in here, and it's basically the same thing as putting this script tag and keeping it at the bottom of the body right here. But instead we can just leave it in the head and put defer. It's going to load after all of the HTML has loaded. Alright, so that's essentially it with the HTML. Now we're going to open our script.js. Usually we call our JS files script or app or index. It's kind of a preference, sort of. But in this case, Glitch made us name it script. So right now, this is the JavaScript. And what we can do is just delete this console.log hi. And we're going to start by talking about some of the document actions. So these are the things that the document is able to read and pick up from the HTML. For example, sometimes we have functions that run when the window is loaded. So for example, we can do window.onload, and then we say equals a function, and then we define this function, and let's just say console.log hi. So this is basically saying whenever we load up our window, which means whenever we open this website in a tab, it's going to console.log hi. So let me show you that. I'm just going to open this in a new window because I really don't know if that works if you don't do that. So our window has been loaded, we see it appear, and if we right click the screen and we click inspect, we can see in our console that we get this line here that says hi. It actually says right next to it where this hi is coming from. It's coming from script.js line 4. And if we go back, we see that indeed it is line 4. So that's kind of where we can see how the window loads and where our console.logs are going to go. So sometimes when you load the window, you may want to perform a specific task, initialize variables, whatever you need to do that you want to do every time that the window loads, you would put in this window.onload function. Now there's also other document actions. One is the onClick function, and this is used a lot of times because a lot of times in our websites we're clicking on things, and this allows us to click on things that are not just links. So remember in our first episode or lesson, we learned how to add links, and then once we click the link, it'll take us to that page. However, sometimes we want to click buttons and maybe open certain tabs or something like that, and we could use that. We could do that using JavaScript and the onClick document action. So let's say I wanted to turn, I don't know, this into a button. What I could do is define an onClick action for that, which I'm going to show you later on, but there's a few more things we need to learn before we can get to that. But what you would do is define an onClick function for this, so whenever the user clicks this, something would happen or a function would be called. Similarly, there's mouse over, so this is very similar to hover. We see that when we hover over these links, we get a red color, and that's the CSS in place, but we can also use the mouse over tool in our JavaScript to do even more things with greater capabilities. For example, you could, when we hover over this image, the image could change using JavaScript. These are all things that our JavaScript is able to do with the mouse over function. And the last one I'm going to talk about is the add event listener action. And that's kind of a very broad and general event listener, or what I mean by event listener is action. So most of these actions are something that the user would do, like they would put their mouse over an element, or they would click something. And the add event listener is kind of listening or looking at all of these things. And we usually use it when we generally want something to happen. So you can use it in replace of onClick, or in replace of mouse over, either one. And it's basically just a broader and more general way of using the onClick and mouse over features. There's also a bunch of other document actions like mouse in, mouse out. I'm pretty sure there's a difference between onClick and click. Yeah, there's a lot. Now we're going to look at selecting elements, and once we know how to do this, the document actions will become more important, and we'll actually see how we can write them in the code. So before we can access elements in our JavaScript, we need to define them in our JavaScript or select them. And the way we do this is by creating a series of variables for each of our elements that we want to select. For example, if we go back to our HTML or go back to our code and we see we have this image here, let's say I wanted to select this image, and maybe once I click it, I want a different image to show up. That's where we're kind of getting with a video slideshow, or a picture slideshow that is going to be the final thing that I'll show you that you can do with JavaScript. So a way that I can select this element, well, there's actually multiple ways I'm going to show you. So if I go back to my JavaScript, I can either select this element with an ID, a class, or a query selector. There's actually way more selectors than this. There's also tag name, but these are the three main ones that we're going to cover. So if I look at my image in my index.html, if I go to this image tag, it says right here, currently it doesn't have an ID. Now, the most common way we can access elements is with an ID, and that's because IDs are specific to that element only. You're usually not going to have elements with more than one ID, so you're going to know that that's the one selected. So what I'm going to do is add an ID to this image, and if you forgot how to do that, we can look at our list, and our list item has an ID and it equals 1. So what we want to do is go to our image, and in our opening tag we can write ID equals, and then we're just going to say first image, first dash image. So now our image has that ID, and when we go back to our JavaScript, we can create a variable and we can say let image equal document dot get element by ID, and then we put these parentheses, and inside these parentheses with our quotation marks, single quotes or double quotes, it doesn't matter, we'll put the name of the ID we want to select. So we're going to say first dash image because that was the ID we gave that image. So now this image or this element So this image element here is now a part of our JavaScript code as this variable called image. Now this document.getElementById, that's something that you're just going to have to remember. It's once you use it more and more, you'll get used to it. And there's also document.getElementBy class names, document.query selector, I'm pretty sure. But I advise you to use the document.getElementById because it's really the easiest one to use, and it's going to prevent you from running into errors because some of the other ones have different features. Like the class one is for selecting multiple elements, and the query selector one is very similar to the ID one, but it's a little different. For this project, you're really only going to need to use document.getElementById. Alright, so now we have this image as a variable in our JavaScript. Now let's do something with this image. Let's say when we click it, we want something to happen. So we can add a document action. So I'm going to add the onClick action, so I can say image.onClick, and then we say equals function, and then inside of this function, we can put whatever we want to happen when the image is clicked. So I'm just going to console log this to start and say this image was, or you clicked the image. Alright, so if I run this, or if I go back to my website, reload it maybe, and then I inspect, so I'm right clicking on the screen and inspecting it, and then I go to console, we can see we get hi, but when I click this image, it says you click the image. And you can't see my mouse. I don't think on the screen recording it doesn't let you see my mouse, but I am clicking the image and I'm continuously clicking it, and you see that this number over here on the right increases. So I am clicking the image, you just can't see my mouse. But that's sort of how our variables work in our DOM JavaScript. So that's sort of the idea, and you can also change this onClick to mouse over, and let's see what that gives us. So I think it might be on mouse over. So if we do that, yep, once we hover over the image, again, you can't see my mouse, but I'm moving back and forth and hovering over it, we get this console.log that says you clicked the image, or you hovered over the image, it should really be. So you can see how these document actions are working for us. Alright, so I don't think we're going to be able to get to document manipulation today, and in that lesson I'm going to show you how to add stuff to the document, create a new element, and things like that. That's going to wrap up this lesson. Hopefully you found this interesting, and I know we covered a lot in this session. It's probably one of the longest sessions we had, but I just want to make sure that we finish on time and that your websites have some good content by the end of next class. So next week we're going to keep going with this JavaScript, and we'll learn how to create an image slideshow on our website, which should be pretty cool. So stay tuned for that. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.